that should work. So yeah, let me briefly introduce today's speaker. Actually, let me switch off the transcript. I'll do that later. Let me actually introduce the speaker for today. We've already seen him at the previous two sessions with Frederik Neirath and Clive Hamilton as well. But I'm happy that Bronislaw Szerszynski is here today. He is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Lancaster University, but he is actually currently joining us from Germany because he is a visiting fellow at the DFG Humanities Center for Advanced Studies on the futures of sustainability at the University of Hamburg. And he just explained that he's having a German summer this summer with plenty of visits to Berlin and so on. He has written a great deal on concepts and conceptualizations of nature and technology, also in relation to the sacred. Back in the day, in 2004, Nature, Technology and the Sacred was the book. He has made extensive contributions to discussions surrounding the concept of Peter Hoff's technoscene, also, of course, in relation to Anthropocene, technosphere, but also technoscene is the word that Agostinho Serrano uses for this, who you're also in conversation with. Together with Nigel Clarke, he published Planetary Social Thought, the Anthropocene Challenge to the Social Sciences, several aspects of which were already mentioned in previous discussions we had during this seminar series as well. Particularly the notion of planetary multiplicity was important, and I'm sure it will reappear today as well. So one of the first texts that I remember reading of Bronislaw Szerszynski was back in 2010 from Theory, Culture and Society. It's called Reading and Writing the Weather. And for me, this was quite an important paper to kickstart my own kind of thinking on the Anthropocene and discussing it with Vincent and others as well in our Wageningen group. And as such, you could also see it as one of the factors leading us to organize this seminar series on planetary technology. So for those of you who haven't yet read that paper, I think it's still a really great read, so I recommend it. But this gives us, of course, plenty of reason to be very glad that Bronislaw is with us here today. And I'm sure that, like myself, everybody is looking forward to this talk. Bronislaw, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so Joachim and I were commenting before on the empty bookcase behind me, which you're free to interpret in relation to the intellectual grounding of what I'm going to say in the next 40 minutes, as you wish. So many thanks to Vincent and Joachim for organising this series, which is a really exciting development, and I always look forward to these talks, and also inviting me to contribute, and also many thanks to Frederik Neirath and Clive Hamilton, as Joachim said, who started off the series so well. So in this talk, what I want to do is do some of my own explorations into the two concepts that Vincent and Joachim used to name and frame the seminar series. That is planetary technology on the one hand and the end of the world on the other, if there are two hands there, and to see how we can use those to shed light on what the Anthropocene might mean, how we can sort of go through it, as it were, to some other kind of imaginary for how we live on this planet. Because of course, as Vincent said before, the overall context for this seminar series is the idea of the Anthropocene, the idea that human activity, especially as extended in modern technological industrial society, is not just altering the surface of the earth and the climate, but has itself become, as earth scientists like Will Steffens say, a geological force overwhelming the great forces of nature, and thereby tipping the dynamics of the earth system, so the earth understood as a system of systems, into a new, uncertain and possibly very inhospitable operating state, one that warrants a whole new unit of the official geological timescale, namely the Anthropocene. So firstly, I'm going to take the term planetary technology and explore 4 different ways of interpreting that term as a claim about the nature of contemporary technology, all of which might independently be true, though in brackets, I myself think that all of them are pretty convincing. So they're not necessarily alternatives, they're just different kind of ways into thinking what the term planetary technology might mean. And they're not exclusive alternatives. You know, they might all be true, or any combination of these true at the same time. And then I'll turn to some, as Vincent was saying, to some recent accounts that explore how the Anthropocene thesis might challenge the conventional phenomenological distinction between world and earth, crudely between, on the one hand, things as they appear to us as human beings, as a world with an intentional as structure, as Heidegger calls it, already filled with meaning. And on the other hand, the earth as the material background condition, unknowable in itself, that exceeds but also makes possible the human condition. And I'll try and knit the two together, presenting, you know, drawing on the book that one of them mentioned, I think it was Joachim, the Planetary Social Thought that I wrote with Nigel Clark, to see how these ideas, when woven together, we can use them to shed light on the Anthropocene predicament and as a new human condition. Okay, so first of all, what does it mean to call technology, or at least contemporary technology, planetary? So what does it mean to say planetary technology? What does that name? And as I say, I can think of at least 4 interpretations of this claim. So the first will be to say that human technology is becoming planetary in what we might call an ontic sense. That is a sense that's concerned more with the empirical facts about the nature of material technological artifacts today. So this would be to say that they are spatially distributed across the planet. They're planetary in this sense, spatially, but also they're being brought into more active relation with each other. And certainly it's hard to deny that technological artifacts and also technical procedures and ways of thinking are becoming increasingly distributed across the surface of the planet. And of course, even both above the planet's surface, in the air, atmosphere, and in outer space, but also below that surface. So that's certainly true, that technology is planetarily distributed more and more. And then also we can see that technology is also increasingly networked and interconnected, whether in the sense of infrastructures that allow the flow of substances like oil or electricity between different devices, or more vicariously through distribution chains, such as the port here in Hamburg, those involved in moving raw materials used in making technologies such as metals, or in powering them, such as oil or natural gas. You think of the pipelines that we're much more aware of now, where they run from Russia or elsewhere. But also the way that technologies guide each other, you know, through digital data, you know. So I'm, as it were, guiding what you can see in front of you through the technologies of Microsoft Teams, but also the way technologies are transformed by each other and transform materials into other kinds of things, so plant materials into food and wood, timber and things, and also distributing devices to be employed in different locations. So you can see that that's another sense in which technology is becoming planetary, is in this sense of so as well as it being distributed globally, it's also becoming much more interconnected. And in an earlier paper, I sort of theorized or speculated that maybe the history of human technology can be roughly divided into 3 phases. The first phase, you know, think of sort of Paleolithic period, of tools that are on the, as it were, on the scale of parts of the human body that extend and multiply the powers of these parts. So, you know, the way that a stone tool, as it were, amplifies the technology of the fist, you know, able to sort of hit things and break things or whatever. And then a second phase, you know, in recent centuries, of self-powering machines that are much more like independent animal bodies themselves, that we, as it were, confront rather like we confront another animal. You know, think of the sort of, you know, machines that powered the Industrial Revolution. You know, the water wheels and the looms and the steam engine and so on. But now we seem to be moving to a more radically interconnected, fungiform, almost fractal network where technologies, so fungiform in the sense of like a sort of fungal mycorrhizal network or something, which crucially that has no characteristic scale. Modern technologies are technologies all the way down to the smallest transistor or element of a transistor, and all the way up through ensembles and technological domains to the global technosphere itself. So there's some sense in which connectedness is a kind of integral feature of modern technology. So, but here I've still really been talking mainly about the kind of physical characteristics, if you like, of modern technology. And let's move on to a second reading of the term planetary technology, which is to say that technology has now taken on the dynamic characteristics of a planetary subsystem. So this is again, I'm blurring the two introductions, Joachim and Vincent's, but the idea of the technosphere, Peter Hauff's technosphere, is what I'm kind of gesturing towards here. So here this is to use the term planetary, not as a merely spatial term, as a synonym to global, but with reference to planetary being or the planetary condition as a particular mode of existence with its own, one might say, local laws, in contrast, for example, to the mode of existence characteristic of other things in the cosmos, such as stars or nebulae or electromagnetic waves. And this is, again, where I'm sort of drawing on some of the work I've been doing with Nigel Clarke. So to summarize very briefly and quickly, planets then are gravitationally collapsed and differentiated bodies of baryonic, that is normal matter, atoms, chemically diverse, held at intermediate temperatures between the sort of coldness of absolute zero and the high temperature of stars, where matter breaks down into plasma and so on. But also planets are held far from thermodynamic equilibrium by flows of energy from their internal core or from their star, while in orbit around a star or stars for geological spans of time, and thereby divide and organize themselves, planets do, into diverse interconnected subsystems. So in a sense, I'm still talking, drawing on the sort of planetary science and, empirical facts about the nature of science. But I think if there's time, I would argue that even, to consider the material nature of planets and what is distinctive about planetary matter, if you like, and the way it behaves, takes us into ontological questions about the local or regional background conditions of possibility of being the kind of beings that we are, human or human-like things. Yes, I am a human-like thing. I will make that claim. So to talk about technology as planetary in this sense is to say that if human techniques once took the form of individual artifacts wielded by individual beings, it has evolved into something trans-individual and transhuman with a character that it shares with other planetary systems, what, as we said before, Peter Hauff calls a technosphere. So Hauff's technosphere is not just planetary in the sense of being globally distributed or even globally networked, although it's both of those things. It also behaves like other systems or compartments of the Earth. It appropriates resources such as mass and energy from other subsystems, and it seems to have generated its own internal characteristic laws of behavior and development. So, I have feedback going on. Can people hear that? So
yeah, I think
maybe we can ask the audience to switch off the microphone so that we can only blame Bronislaw if there are interruptions.
My stomach rumbling. Yeah. Interestingly, this Teams call is developing its own internal laws of development in terms of feedback effects and so on. Anyway, so these internally generated laws or rules, Hauff argues, constrain the behaviour and possibilities for action of its constituent parts, whether technological or human, and have the overall effect of entraining, as it were, drawing in to its operation more and more of the Earth's resources. And interestingly, the empirically grounded work of my colleague at Lancaster, Andrew Jarvis, seems to confirm such theoretical claims. Looking at the curves of energy and resource use over the last 150 years, Andrew Jarvis has shown that as technologies become planetary in this sense, of sort of becoming globally distributed, globally connected, the falling efficiency of its resource acquisition and distribution networks due to longer path lengths, you know, as it were, the technosphere having to reach further and further across the planet and deeper into the layers of the planet to gain its resources. This growing inefficiency has been compensated for by the innovation and diffusion of new technologies, dematerialization, and increased end-use efficiencies at rates which seem to be regulated by the overall system dynamics, as if as it were, the technosphere has its own desired rate of growth and modulates its internal dynamics, including economic activities by human beings, you know, at exactly the right rate to keep it on track. Okay, so now I've introduced two senses of planetary technology. The first more spatial and empirical, the second more dynamic and more attentive to the specific nature of planetary existence, you know, the idea of the technosphere. And a third interpretation of planetary technology that's even more clearly ontological in character will be to see the adjective planetary as pointing to the way that contemporary technology seizes the planet as its object. And as I think Vincent it was who gestured towards this sort of question in the philosophy of technology, the sort of classic question posed by Heidegger in his question concerning technology, whether modern technology has this certain characteristic of Gestell or enframing, whereby non-human nature is turned into mere Bestand or standing reserve. And contemporary technologies do, even more literally than the hydroelectric plant discussed by Heidegger, seek to seize and enframe the whole planet as their object. To see technology as planetary in this sense is to say that the planet and its systems are themselves being enframed, seized as an object of technological control and manipulation. And Joachim and Vincent in the 2017 paper, Saving Earth, have more or less, you know, said that kind of thing. And the most obvious examples might be planet scale things, literally planet scale things like climate geoengineering and terraforming that want to take a planet, whether the Earth in the first case, or Mars, for example, in the second case, as raw matter to be transformed according to a blueprint. But as mentioned before, Agostinho Serra, in his Philosophical Journey to the Anthropocene book, published this year, argues that in the Anthropocene, in a sense, all of nature is turned into a pet, or petified, as he calls it, domesticated and somehow diminished in its ontological significance to us. Okay, so now I've talked about three different interpretations of planetary technology. One, that it's globally distributed and networked. Two, that it is developing the dynamic characteristics of an autopoietic, self-steering planetary system. And three, that it somehow enframes and belittles and diminishes the whole planet. And I'll return to this third idea of modern technology as enframing later, adding some thoughts about how it also enframes the human subject in an illusionary insulation from the effects of technology. But for now, I want to add a fourth interpretation of the term planetary technology. And this is to say that this would involve the claim that technology is planetary not only in its destination, i.e., you know, that it's what technology seizes as its object, but also in its origin. That technology, or at least technics in its more general sense, is not just becoming planetary, but is in some sense was always already planetary, that it has its roots, its conditions of possibility in the very nature of planetary being. So this would be to say that technics, properly understood, is not something wholly sui generis, something that emerges completely de novo with human beings or other smart animals like crows or other apes and so on, but it's something that planets do. Okay, so in Planetary Social Thought, Nigel Clarke and I argued that thinking in a planetary way requires us to engage with the growing scientific understanding of planets as a specific kind of natural entity. And I've done that a bit already in this talk, talking about how planets can develop subsystems with their own self-maintaining dynamics. But more fundamentally, I think, is the fact that planets are constantly self-differentiating, getting out of step with themselves, becoming other to themselves, all spatial and temporal scales. If it wasn't for this character of planets, Nigel and I suggest, it would not be possible for them to produce an entity like the human being that could shift them into a new operating state. And as I think Vincent mentioned, Nigel and I call this feature of planets planetary multiplicity, using the term to draw on what Henri Bergson and Gilles Deleuze thought of as a kind of difference that is not just between things, though planets are, of course, numerically and qualitatively different to each other, Earth, Venus, Mars, etc., but a kind of difference that's internal to things, a difference that is a sort of force that drives what Bergson called creative evolution, here understood as planetary evolution, whereby each planet can plot and drive its own unique course through the possibility space open to it because of the class of planet to which it belongs, whether rocky planet, ice giant, or gas giant like Jupiter and Saturn. Okay, so where does technics come into this idea of planetary multiplicity? Well, here I think we can usefully use Terence Deacon's idea in his book Incomplete Nature 2012 of the role played by what he calls orthograde and contragrade processes in the emergence of higher level complex material phenomena. So Deacon defines orthograde processes as those that happen spontaneously to an entity. Literally, to quote him, orthograde processes are those that go with the grade or tilt, so grade in the sort of sense of a slope, or tilt or tendency of things, as in falling or going along with the flow. So that's a quote from him. So this orthograde processes would include things that we think of as simple thermodynamic processes, moving towards equilibrium or the lowest energy state. For example, my cup of tea cooling to room temperature over time, although I've asked someone to bring one in a warm one later on, defying entropy, or a stone rolling downhill. But what's interesting about Deacon's term is it also applies to more complex entities in which an orthograde process might, for example, take the form of a deer or a rabbit continuing to graze, because that is the activity proper to these ruminant animals, or a television continuing, or a screen like this screen in front of you, continue to show the same channel of information, whatever behavior proper to that kind of entity to do, if not disturbed from outside. But planets and their component entities, like us, also do what Deacon calls contragrade things. These are processes that are those that do not happen spontaneously. As Deacon puts it, they are, quote, changes in the state of a system that must be extrinsically forced because they run counter to orthograde tendencies, end quote. So maybe it might be clear now that, roughly speaking, whereas orthograde processes can be seen as a reframing of the concept of the natural, the inherent tendency of things, in the sense of the inherent tendency of things, contragrade corresponds more to the idea of the artificial, that unlikely event that needs external intervention to bring about. So roughly speaking, those two terms can map onto the idea of the sort of natural and the artificial. But what I like about Deacon's understanding of the contragrade is that this external intervention or extrinsic forcing that produces contragrade processes does not necessarily require some kind of transcendent conscious will operating on natural processes from outside, like the human mind or something. As Deacon puts it, quote, it is because of the heterogeneous and complex nature of planets that there can be contragrade processes. So within planetary bodies made up of all these different kinds of matter, undergoing different kinds of processes, separating out from each other in these different fluxes and flows and cycles and things, solid matter, fluid matter, processes operating on different time scales. When two or more orthograde processes interact, sometimes each can constrain each other and push each other away from realizing their orthograde tendencies, what they would have done in isolation, thus, in a sense, performing work on each other in the physics sense of work, pushing each other into unlikely contragrade directions, with the combined effect, once you add them all together, of creating emergent complexity at a higher level of organization. Now, Terence Deacon's own focus in Incomplete Nature is on understanding the origins and nature of biological life and why biological matter behaves so differently from inorganic matter. But for me, you know, and particularly with my interest in inorganic matter and what it can do, and thinking about the creativity of plants more broadly, beyond the traditionally biological, this idea that parts of a planet can do work on each other and create emergent effects and local order can help us understand other kinds of features of what Adam Frank and et al. in a astrobiological paper when he was working with Axel Kleiden and somebody else I can't remember, called class 2 planets. These are planets that, like Earth, but also like Mars and Venus, actually, you know, Mars and Venus, the class 2 planets, because they are planets that have both solid and fluid compartments, you know, atmospheres and perhaps oceans. No, probably don't actually have oceans, but they're both our atmospheres, kept away from equilibrium by flows of energy. And even these planets without biological life, because of the nature of this kind of planet, they seem prone to develop more complex, recursive or recurrent meshworks of causation, in which flows of matter and energy generate larger scale and longer lasting structures that in turn serve to shape and amplify the lower level processes that produce them in a constant evolution of form. So the way that planets like the Earth, but also other our near neighbours Mars and Venus in their own way, can generate and maintain contragrade processes within and between their constituent parts, keeping them away from quiet equilibrium, can be seen as a kind of techniques that's distributed throughout the planet, where one planetary process is literally applying work onto another, imposing constraints onto it, decreasing its degrees of freedom, breaking its symmetry, and enabling it to do radically unlikely things. And this play between the orthograde and the contragrade in planetary matter is part of, I think, what Spinoza was talking about when he coined the term natura naturans, by which he means nature naturing. That's how it's normally translated into English, at least. Nature seen not just as a fixed product, but as a continuous process of becoming. And this is a technique that is not just between different entities, but also between different spatial and temporal scales and mereological levels within the same entity or subsystem, so that the atmosphere can do techniques on itself, if you like. And this is an originary technique that does not just wait for higher emergent powers like life and consciousness to manifest, but is part of the very machinery of that emergence. You know, if it wasn't for this kind of originary planetary techniques, there couldn't be life, there couldn't be consciousness, and there couldn't be modern technology. And a good illustration of this, I think, is the work done by Axel Kleiden at Jena, his analysis of the Earth as a thermodynamic heat engine, where different subsystems do work on each other, pushing each other back up. To these, I dropped out there. I hope you can hear me. Joachim, nod if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I can hear you.
You were referring to your colleague, to I forgot his name, from Jena,
Kleiden.
and then you.
Yeah.
And so if you pick up there, then we can continue.
Yeah, and that's Axel Kleiden, the Earth system scientist, who in his 2016 book on the thermodynamics of the Earth system, you know, I'm building a lot on his understanding of the Earth as a thermodynamic heat engine, where all the different subsystems of the Earth are kind of working on each other, keeping each other away from thermodynamic equilibrium and maintaining a much more complex and creative planetary environment, which, in a sense, life, let alone conscious life, is able to take advantage of, but it wouldn't, you know, it's already a planet which is made more generative by the work, the creative work that these systems are doing on each other, this kind of planetary techniques. Okay, so but I'll return to these four senses of planetary technology later. But now I must turn, because time's ticking on, to the second part of my title, The End of the World. And if I may be so bold, I wanted to first summarize some points that I imagine Vincent might have made if he had been able to deliver the first opening seminar in this series. Building on the 2017 paper that he wrote with Joachim, in a more recent paper called The Earth Means the World to Me, Vincent argues that we need a new round of reflection on the world historical significance of climate change as a disruption of humans' relationship with the Earth. So here he's reflecting on this phenomenological idea that he set up in the introduction, that humans always already inhabit a meaningful world, a stable and permanent ground or interior milieu, a meaningful world that's embedded in the material Earth as an exterior milieu. And as I think he mentioned earlier, other writers such as Timothy Morton in his Hyperobjects book have argued that climate change signifies the end of the world in this phenomenological sense of the word world. Echoing Bill McKibben's argument in his The End of Nature from 1990, he's saying that the mark of human activity is there on every single part of the planet, every single thing the planet does, resulting in what McKibben calls the end of nature, in the sense that even when we see a rain falling even in a forest, far from human habitation, it bears what McKibben calls a permanent stamp of man, using that generic term for humankind. That in the sense we can't see nature anymore because it's so permanently, as it were, stained. Our romantic idea of a nature other than the human, other than the artificial, is kind of being lost because of the systemic effects of human activity on nature. And Morton gives this idea of a gestalt switch, an even more strictly phenomenological reading. Now, the world, says Morton, can't be decomposed into inner and outer, foreground and background, if you like, horizon of being and Dasein, being there. For Morton, thinking on a planetary scale means instead waking up inside an object, or rather a series of objects wrapped in objects, what he calls hyperobjects, things like Earth, biosphere, climate, global warming. So he's suggesting there that the planet was probably always a massively distributed and entangled hyperobject, and climate change has only exposed this feature of human being in the world. But in contrast, Vincent argues in this paper from a couple of years ago that what we're going through is not the end of the world, because it is a constitutive feature of being a human being that we already inhabit, or as Heidegger put it, we're always thrown into a meaningful world. We can't avoid it. It's part of being human. And so Vincent argued that what we're experiencing at the moment is merely the end of the Holocene world. Of course, the Holocene, the epoch covering the last 12,000 years of a kind of relatively stable, moderate climate, during which human beings developed agriculture, cities, and settled civilizations. And instead, Vincent argued, we're entering a new world, an Anthropocene world where reality appears in a different way, so that rather so whereas the Holocene world was experienced as stability, the Anthropocene world is more directly embedded in the exterior milieu of an Earth whose givenness or facticity is volatility, and climate change is the obvious example of that. And in terms of the normative implications, Vincent argues that philosophy needs to move away from its current focus on what he calls world production and world interest, which only results in an alienation from, as it were, the Earth as such, the Earth as planet. Instead, he argues we need to recognize that Earth is the ground of world. That our world is grounded in Earth, but the Earth does not produce world as its goal. So this is the call, as it were, to move towards an ethics-based around a non-anthropocentric idea of Earth interest, or what he calls a feralization of human life, a sort of wilding, if you like, of the human life, placing ourselves back with it, as one species amongst many, I suppose, in the planet. And I think one could argue that there's not that much difference. One could argue that there's not that much difference between Morton, what Timothy Morton argues and what Vincent argues. Both think that the Anthropocene dissolves not just the ontic distinction between artificial and natural entities in a way that McKibben was talking about back in 1990, but also the ontological one between world and earth, foreground and background, interior and exterior milieu. But where Morton says that when background and foreground merge, there is no world, just enfolded hyperobjects. Vincent wants to hang on to that idea of the world, but just say that the Anthropocene world is different from the Holocene world. And thinking about the difference there and whether that is a big difference or not, depending which way you look at it, it made me go back and look at the work of Deborah Danofsky and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. Their book I think it's called The Ends of the World, plural, and in which they draw on Amerindian perspectives, because of course Eduardo Viveiros de Castro is a well-known anthropologist of Amerindian cultures, Amazonian cultures in particular. And in their book, they talk about modern Westerners, the white Europeans, if you like, as worldless people. And I think that's sort of interesting new spin on this sort of idea. And they link this, what they see, this long-standing worldlessness of modern European existence, if you like, to contemporary melancholic cultural themes in Western thought that dwell in a quite maudlin way, if you like, on the prospect of a future world after humans, exhibited whether in contemporary philosophy of people like Ray Brassier, but also in popular culture like Lars von Trier's film Melancholia, with lots of talk about the Anthropocene as the end of the human and the world after us, imagining, sort of architectural features sort of declining in the future and being taken over by rainforests and being discovered by alien geologists, some vanished race. And Viveiros de Castro and Danofsky argue that these melancholic worlds without us depend on establishing what they call a maximal discontinuity between a sublunar or terrestrial perspective and a supralunar or cosmic one, a bifurcation of nature in Alfred North Whitehead's sense. And here they're drawing a lot on Bruno Latour's work, especially his Gifford lectures, where he, of 2013, where Latour suggested that we need a new kind of world to replace this worldless world of the moderns, and a new people. So Latour's world of the moderns, which he thinks we need to move beyond, is one of imagining humans divided from nature in what he calls the modern constitution, and instead we need to think of the humans separate from nature being replaced by terrans, a new kind of configuration of what it is to be human, much more as an earthbound condition, not separate from nature. And interestingly, they use this image of a Möbius strip, the strip of paper that is joined, but before it's joined, it's twisted over so that it only has one side and one edge. And I think that's a lovely image to kind of try to capture the world and earth are two sides of reality that in some sense have to be separate for us to be human. But when you follow them far enough, they connect with each other. They're both separate and not separate. And I think this resonates really nicely with the idea of planetary multiplicity as Nigel and I use it in our book, that as you follow the planet in its wanderings, if you like, remember planet literally means a sort of wandering star. And I mean follow here in its senses temporally, spatially, in terms of scale. If you wander around different forms of planetary matter and self-organization, you find that it has become other to itself from within itself. Cup of tea. Thank you for defying entropy. Thank you for me. But also remember that what I was saying about meaning for a planetary technology above, that human technics is arguably a version of the planet's power to generate contragrade processes that go against their natural internal tendency. So I suggested there that the implication of this is that techniques and work is happening, to quote the film, which I haven't watched, but I'm aware of at the moment, everywhere, all the time, all at once. So techniques and work is happening everywhere, all the time, all at once. But if that is happening everywhere through the planet, so too is worlding, perhaps, the division, however partial or fleeting, into foreground and background, internal and external milieu, a division that itself has a Möbius strip topology, and that the external milieu only really comes into being, the outside, the background, if you like, by the emergence of an internal milieu, so is in some sense inherent within it. Okay, so here I just want to make a brief excursus into Hannah Arendt's human condition, which Vincent mentions briefly, I think, in his paper, this idea of earth alienation. And it made me go back to thinking about the way Hannah Arendt in her book, The Human Condition, talks about the relationship between these, what she calls modernity's twofold flight. On the one hand, from the world into the self, and the other from the earth into the universe. So she mobilizes this world-earth distinction in a particular kind of way, and then relates them together in her kind of critique of 20th century modernity. So for Arendt, modern world alienation is, quote, the atrophy of the space of appearance and the withering of common sense. So here, a retreat from the public, the space of appearance, where we appear as political beings with each other and act in the public realm, and instead of retreating into a private space of kind of pure subjectivity. So here, I mean, very prescient in relation to contemporary concerns about post-truth, you know, that she's saying this was kind of lurking in modernity from the beginning. And then what very relevant to what we're talking about in this seminar series is what she calls the simultaneous and linked earth alienation, which is grounded in modern science and technology, what she calls, quote, the discovery and taking possession of the earth, quote. So very resonant with that third meaning of planetary technology I talked to above, as the ontological enframing of nature as standing reserve. And consistent with Danofsky and Rivera de Castro, this earth alienation involves looking at the earth from a cosmic perspective, as Tim Ingold would put it, to look at the earth, to experience the earth as a globe from without, from outside, as an object that we stand outside, as it were, perceptually, rather than as a sphere that we inhabit from within. But I think there's another slightly more Marxian dimension to Arendt's account of earth alienation that maybe helps us to link it to world alienation as well. And this is grounded in her analysis of the human condition in terms of work, sort of labour, work and action in the human condition. And so, I mean, very briefly, Arendt argues that the givenness of the world as a stable background for meaningful human life depended on the existence of what she calls a homo faber, a particular version of the human being, that is the human being as maker, of manipulator of matter, according to a goals-directed means-ends logic of utility. And so homo faber for, Hannah Arendt sees one aspect of the human condition as being our animal being, if you like. She calls this aspect of the human condition animal laborans, the labouring animal. And so to the extent that we are still grounded in the endless flux of nature, the sort of dissipative flow of energy and matter through nature, to the extent to which we're natural beings, we have to labour without cease to meet our needs. We have to, you know, that's the metabolism of human beings, our dependency on flows of food and water and air and everything. This continuous, endless process animals, that we share with other living things. But in contrast, Homo faber acts as the conqueror of nature, not as the servant of the life processes. Homo faber removes material from its location in nature, from the cycles of growth and decay, in order to make enduring things. Homo faber carves an enduring world, a material as well as meaningful world, an ensemble of objects and structures that serve as a setting for human affairs. But also Homo faber is the end of nature, in the sense of being that being in which the rest of nature can appear to find its purpose and meaning. And then, she argues, in industrial modernity, and especially in its later phase of consumer capitalism, that undergirds what we now call the late 20th century great acceleration of the flow and transformation of materials around the world. The enduring world as a background for shared public life disappears for Arendt, and its human inhabitants retreat into subjective private worlds with no permanency, in a sense become animal labyrinths once more, labouring without cease in service to a life process that exceeds them. But now this is the life process which is the endless growth of the modern economy, what she calls an unnatural rise of the natural.
You have about 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, lovely.
Yeah.
One that compromises the integrity and purpose of the artifactual world and then turns on and threatens the rest of life. So here I think she's really anticipating Haft's idea of the technosphere. Okay, so I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit, so I want to make sure I get to my conclusion. Yeah, I just want to say something briefly about, I talked about how we can extend this idea about the sort of ontological inframing done by distinctively modern technology, the technology characteristic of the modern technosphere. But here I want to turn our gaze around 180 degrees and focus not so much on how it turns the natural world into standing reserve, but what it does to the human wielder of technology, promising certainty. The way that the modern technosphere seems to work through creating asymmetries of being effect and being affected, the way it distributes roles, agency, and entropy. As Andrew Feenberg puts it, in modern technology, the subject of technical action isolates itself as much as possible from the effects of its action. And I think, in a way, here we can see there are interesting parallels between this aspect of modern technology, the way it tries to insulate the wielder of technology from the effects of their action, and Western social thought, the way it pictures the human being, and especially the modern human, as somehow floating free from material processes. So this sort of modern subject that is imagined as having its own history and agency, which is separate from planetary processes, exempt from planetary processes. It is this modern subject that seems to fear the end of the world. It's the one that's sort of threatened by the changes that are happening here, the apocalyptic reading of the Anthropocene. But of course, this idea of the end of the world has already happened for many, or its experiences already happened for many non-Western peoples, especially those whose ancestors were enslaved or had their land settled by Europeans, as indigenous scholars like Kyle White argue. So that the very idea of a stable, given Holocene world imagined in European thought was not just an intellectual achievement, but also a geopolitical one. It had to be organized geospatially through conquest and colonialism, slavery and the plantation system, through establishing unequal ecological exchange of cheap raw materials and high value goods of order and entropy across the planet, and thus ensuring that it was racialized bodies, non-European bodies, if you like, that bore the impact of Earth processes, often made even more turbulent by colonial interventions. Okay, so coming to my conclusion, what are the implications of my exploration of planetary technology and discourses of the end of the world for the Anthropocene? What I'm arguing, I suppose, is that the Anthropocene world and the technosphere, once you sort of explore them more deeply, opens up to the far wider and more fundamental reality of the planetary as the condition of possibility for the human condition. The planet of the new epoch is not exactly a humanized planet, as the Anthropocene term implies, because the human itself opens up to the planet and thus to the inhuman. In planetary social thought, as well as planetary multiplicity, we develop a complementary idea of earthly multitudes, our term for human collectives who, through skilled interaction with matter, are able to adapt to or leverage self-othering tendencies of planetary matter, focusing it over thresholds. We argue that human agency, like the more than human techniques buried in the complex contragrade behaviors of planetary matter, always depends on working with the tendencies of planetary matter. So was always planetary, and the human opens out into the inhuman. So back to the idea of the Terrans as a new kind of figuring of the human as developed by Bruno Latour, Donofsky, and Vieira de Castro. If the imagined Anthropocene world, the sort of the technosphere, if you like, is a worldless world that tries to make the planet superlunary, sort of cosmic, you know, the view from the cosmos, the Möbius world of the Terrans is a sublunary world of becoming, one in which we realize that the fundamental separation of interior and exterior milieu was always an illusion, or at least more complicated than we imagine. So I think we can start to put flesh on Vincent's normative ideas about earth interest and the feralization of the human in conclusion. So my concluding 4 sentences are to say, firstly, the Anthropocene is only partly a new distinctive world. I think it's kind of revelatory power for us is that the way it reveals something more fundamental than what we're doing to the planet now. It reveals the always already planetary nature of the human world, a Möbius strip world, without a stable background, instead open to planetary differentiation and flux. You know, that our very powers to, as it were, make over the world through technology are powers which also bind us into and are dependent on our mixing our powers with the powers of the planet in general. Second, the Anthropocene also exposes the nature of a modern techniques that seems to promise to secure the human as a sort of isolated wielder against the effects and side effects of technology, when in fact it only secures the existence of the fortunate by exposing others, whether they're humans and non-humans, making them unfortunate. This kind of geospatial ordering of modern technology. And instead, I think it can give us clues to imagining, thirdly, a different technique, a technique that's open to a constant play between the parts of a planet in constant becoming, and a more humble, yes, to use Vincent's term, feralized technique that is skilled, collective, more than human negotiation, one through experiment, try and error, and experience, but also a technique that learns how to not just recoil from and seek to insulate itself from planetary differentiation, that learns how to delight into and to, as it were, take pleasure and advantage from constant planetary self-differentiation. Thank you.
Jochem, I guess.
Oh.
Yeah, are you frozen or not?
No, I'm here.
I'm here.
Jochem, maybe you have to switch off your camera because my feeling is that you're the picture is, the video is frozen.
Okay, is this better?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Bronislaw. That was, yeah, I'm sorry you can't see me now, but I hope you can hear me. That was really enjoyable and interesting talk. I think this more, let's call it speculative perspective that you bring in, if I can call it that, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all, is a nice addition to what we have been discussing in this series. So thank you for this. I have a couple of questions which mostly concern the metaphysics of what you're proposing. The first is, I think, more for clarification, whereas the second is perhaps a bit of a challenge to your ideas, of course, in a friendly spirit. So I'll limit myself to these two to also leave room for others, but hopefully we can discuss later. So I'm very much intrigued, first of all, by how you mobilize Deacon's conceptualization of orthograde and contragrade processes. So as I understood it, if you have two, let's say two for the sake of simplicity, orthograde processes encountering each other or interacting, this can give rise to contragrade directions or processes. So my question is, would I then be correct in assuming that these orthograde processes are never self-sufficient, in the sense that there is always a certain remainder of what can perhaps be called a potentiality? And I don't mean a potentiality with a teleology, but some kind of potentiality. I'm thinking of Simondon's notion of Gilbert Simondon's notion of communication between individuated beings, where these individuated beings always carry, as it were, a remainder of potentiality, which he refers to as pre-individual potentiality, which can then initiate new individuations when communicating, when entering into communication. So the crystallization is the most famous example there. So basically my question is it correct to think of these orthograde processes as carrying such a pre-individual remainder? And would you say that Deacon can be intelligibly read through Simondon's lens, or maybe also the other way around? Maybe I'll just state my second question first before my connection drops out, and then we'll see where we go. So that's mostly a question for clarification. Then the second one is, you mentioned how you attempt, or at least that's how I understood you, to in a way dissolve the idea of technology into a more general techniques, and then techniques into a more planetary becoming. This is how I understood your notion of originary techniques that does not just wait for, say, higher emergent powers, such as craftsmen or the Homo faber or whatever figure to manifest, but is actually part of the very machinery of emergence itself. And I would say that this is quite a radical take on originary technicity or originary techniques, arguably even more radical than what Bernard Stiegler proposes, which is without doubt intriguing and interesting if it were that radical. So I very much like it. At the same time, I wonder in what sense this can still be meaningfully called techniques. So as a really simple question, what do we mean here when we speak of techniques? And do we still want to differentiate it from something like physis? You mentioned how you want to map these kinds of concepts also on the orthograde and contragrade processes. So what do we mean with techniques? And is the work or the becoming that techniques does, as it were, still to be differentiated from other types or other kinds of works? Because it seems to me that your notion of originary techniques on the one hand bids farewell to the Aristotelian distinction between physis and techne, but at the same time you seem to want to hold on to that kind of distinction as well. So yeah, again, would also maybe Simondon's differentiation between various kinds of individuation, so physical, living, psychical, technical, and so on, be relevant towards this question? Thank you. I'll leave my camera on off for now.
Yeah. Thanks, Joachim. I mean, it's two great questions. I mean, I'll try and answer them briefly because I know I ran over slightly, and I want to leave time for other people to join in the conversation. I mean, I have read Simondon a bit, but and you know, has been an influence on my work and with Nigel as well. But I don't know his work. I think I don't know his work as well as you do. So in terms of your first question about potentiality, I would need to think more about that. And I certainly think you're right. I think your instinct is right. Is that Deacon's work, is very sophisticated on it's a sort of theory of emergence, basically, on sort of which is based on an understanding of sort of mereological levels, of whole and part, and their sort of different kinds of causation, up and downwards causation, and its role in the emergence of complex phenomena. And yet he's not really thinking metaphysically most of the time. He's not a sort of ontological or metaphysical thinker, and I think there is a lot of it would be interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting questions to ask about, particularly this idea about remainder and potentiality there, and that is something that we do. Nigel and I talk about a lot, is this sort of idea of that what we so for example, what we should value about the planet is not just actual, but also its potential to do new things. If planets are self-differentiating, then part of what we need to appreciate there is it's the possibility of doing radically new things in the future, which are completely latent. But I do. Yeah, so I think I need to think more about your first question, but maybe we can talk about that another time. The second question, it's interesting too that do I go a bit too far in, as it were, taking originary technicity into the very machinery of emergence itself? And yes, I think that's probably true that I do. As a thought experiment, for this talk, I have taken it further than I've ever taken it before. And I think one thing that is distinctive about techne, human techne, if you like, is a certain kind of it's sort of, if you think of the tool, I know it's not very fashionable to think of technologies as tools, in fossil technology, but if you think of it, for example, the human tool, so this cup that was brought in for me for my cup of tea, it can contain different kinds of things. It has a certain kind of what Jacques Monod calls a gratuity in its relationship to its contents. It could have tea in it or coffee, or it could be for a different person as well. It could be not for a human being. And there is something about that aspect of technology, that sort of liberation of a technology from both its wielder, but also its object of its application, which is somehow inherent to our idea of technology. Whereas if you make the idea of techniques so, as it were, imminent to physical processes, then you've lost that sort of sense of its transitiveness, if you like. The fact that it can that we think of technology as kind of repeatable and separable from its cause and its effect. And I think nevertheless, I think you can still defend that some of that kind of separation that we think of as inherent to human technology does occur in some kind of way in more than human processes. It's just that you've got to be, I think I was being very excessively casual, if you like, in extending it very rapidly, whereas now I think it's probably, if I had longer, would want to start to qualify some of that and explore some of those qualifications like you suggest.
Sure. Okay, sure. Thank you for this first round of reflection, Bronislaw, and also thank you for your excellent question, Jochem. If I am informed correctly, you have to leave earlier, so I hope you can stay around, Jochem, but I can take over from here and then you are free to go. In the meantime, I guess that also the rest of the audience might have questions. I suggest that you use then the raise hand function that you have at the upper side of your screen, so that I can navigate and manage a little bit the discussion. And we have 20 minutes left. And in the meantime, if you don't mind, I kick off then myself, because then you have the time to raise your questions. Bronislaw, thank you very much for your presentation. I have, of course, many questions, you can imagine, because also you refer to our work. But I have one pressing question, which is a little bit connected with Jochem's point, that might be interesting here, is that I also have the feeling that you push a little bit too far the equation between physis and techne. And in my view, in a way, techne always has to do with human technology. So it's always, technology is always about human technology relations. And you started your whole argument by talking about planetary technology and by talking about other planets. And I can imagine, I have also wrote about the conativity, what you mentioned, spontaneously movements in other planets. But the characteristic of other planets is that there is no life on these other planets. And my assumption is that, in a way, if you want to make sense of techniques, then you are also bound to planets that are occupied by life in a way or another. So I do not object to the idea of spontaneous movements, what I call conativity of materiality, and the conativity of materiality to spontaneously develop order. That is not the problem. I can live with that. I even would support that idea. But to call this already technology, techniques, that is maybe a little bit too far, because you can say that technology or techniques involves also human life, responsiveness in complementarity to conativity, for instance. How would you frame this notion of techniques that I connected with life, at least? While and is that maybe a way out in the equation between physis and techne that you introduced here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a danger that in my talk I have gone too far in lots of directions, all at once, and it's too much for us, in the remaining time we have in this seminar, or even maybe in the whole seminar series, to kind of just wind back in, and let's do some kind of more analytical specificity. So certainly in a lot of my recent work, I have been sort of pushing against, pushing this sort of idea of inorganic life, as Manuel de Landa calls it, the sort of, this idea that non-biological matter, as it were, can have its own kind of life, and in some forms this is not so dissimilar to, Ilya Prigoghine's dissipative structures and what Deacon calls morphogenesis, of self-organizing, shape production, within non-living systems. But I am sort of intrigued by this sort of idea that, which really was given, that I got from Stanislav Lem, the science fiction writer, that, in his novel Fiasco, where he talks about worlds without evolution by natural selection, where matter is not constrained by evolution by natural selection and is able to find other ways to experiment. And I mean, yes, this is science fiction, but I do think we need to be open to the idea that given enough time, planets far from equilibrium, planetary matter is maybe able to generate forms of, complex matter capable of self-complexifying, which do not map onto our ideas of biological life. That's the first thing to say. I mean, I suppose the other thing, another way of replying is that by kind of fusing, if you like, or accentuating or de-accentuating the difference between, techne and physis in this way, I'm partly saying that physis has its own kind of techne, so I'm trying to re-describe, as it were, planetary matter as having its own, sort of, self-differentiation, which we can use ideas of technical action to understand better. And this is where the contragrade idea comes in. But I'm also using it to perform the other movement as well, which is to try to emphasize the extent to which in our technological manipulation of the planetary matter, we have to, as it were, undergo a choreography. We're forced to behave in a way which is not dissimilar to the way that other, more than human planetary processes act on each other. So another book that was a big influence on this thinking for me was the book The Control of Nature by John McPhee, and the title is an ironic title because he tries to say that the control of nature, you imagine it's about humans controlling nature, but in some sense it's about nature controlling humans. And the example he uses is things like trying to control the flow of rivers like the Mississippi or the flow of lava, and the way that in order to try to steer Earth processes, you have to think, as it were, think like a river or think like lava, and that the human activity is choreographed as much by the lava as the lava is by human activity. Yep. And this, I'm kind of saying, is a sort of inherent part of technical action, which is where two orthograde processes are constraining each other, so that what I'm saying is we need to reimagine techne, that it is a bit more like physis and vice versa.
Yeah, but so because there is no other person who's raising his or her hand, I'm still waiting for questions, but then I can also continue with the discussion. The risk is a little bit that we have a raised hand. Very good. The risk is a little bit that you commit to this whole tendency towards post-humanism in which everything is connected with each other. Like in your example, physis and techne is completely interconnected, and there are no categorical differences between there are no ontological categories at all. And that was for me the reason to introduce a distinction between Earth and world, namely to introduce the Earth as a domain of asymmetry, contrary to the world as a symmetric domain. And I believe that is, for me at least, the way out to understand this multiplicity of your idea of planets. Because if there's only multiplicity of planets if there is an asymmetry between these planets. And if we move along with the post-humanist, with Timothy Morton in hyper-object way of thinking, then, or Latour, everything is conflated in a way that there are no fundamental difference anymore. And that was maybe one of the reasons for me to write also this article on the Earth means the world to me, in order to rehabilitate this ontological level of understanding of the Earth as that which is which is not part of our world. But we can discuss this later. I'm happy to move on to Carl Olsen, who has a question. Please, Carl, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for the talk, Bronislaw. No, actually, I was going to sort of almost follow up on that and to sort of put the question in slightly different terms to Bronislaw, because it seems to me that what's actually happening here with respect to sort of the potential sort of disintegration of the world into the earth, is, you know, it's a change of the proposition seems to be that we're going to take on a different frame of reference, and the new frames of reference can be spatial, it can be temporal, and it can be ontological in a sense. And so it's not really about so much about, it seems to me, is this what you have in mind, Bronislaw? And I wonder if you can speak to me about it. It's not so much about blurring things, but simply taking a different sort of, I call it the frame of reference, to see what sort of salient differences stand out from a different scale or from a different perspective that might be ontological and so forth. Is that right? Just to understand what sort of the terms of this discussion.
I think, insofar as I understand the distinction you're making, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, certainly, I mean, just although I am in some sense blurring things, I'm also interested in making, you know, distinctions. A paper I published a couple of years ago called Colloidal Social Theory, about colloids, you know, in sort of what I call sort of the strange liveliness of colloidal matter. I kind of say something at the beginning, position myself in relation to other people like Jane Bennett and Ingold, who also talk about the animacy of non-animate things, and try to distinguish the way what I'm doing, that I'm not saying, as it were, that all matter is alive, but that I'm saying that in a sense we still need to carve the world up and make distinctions, but that yes, that I'm sort of carving the world up in a different kind of way, if you like, in a way that cuts across the, you know, the human and the non-human, the living and the non-living, but still it absolutely doesn't say that there's no distinction to make between things. So yes, it is a kind of frame of reference shift as well. I mean, is that kind of does that answer what you're saying?
Yes, I think so. I was a little bit facetiously almost, but trying to make you say that, because what is it that sort of for you makes you start somewhere in order to how do you essentially, how do you know what kinds of distinctions are interesting, if that makes sense as a question? Then sort of, you know, how do you get to the point of, it's a very philosophical question, but how do you get to the point of sort of picking out the right sort of interesting distinctions that are more interesting than the ones we have perhaps taken for granted in modernity?
Oh, I mean, that's such a hard question, you know, like how, because in a way it's you know, the position I'm kind of put forward in the talk, in a way, is the result of, you know, the last, you know, nearly a decade and a half of discussions around the Anthropocene, experiments with artists, you know, launching balloons into the atmosphere, speculative writing, but also a kind of lots and lots of discussions which are, you know, partly about the nature of contemporary technology, but are also about the kind of the challenge to Western thought that's coming from sort of the sort of decolonizing tendency, you know, pushback against thought, and trying to you know, to come up with a position which, you know, is sort of adequate to this kind of, you know, perfect storm of challenges we have at the moment, you know, of planetary change, also, but also of a sort of you know, the challenging of a certain kind of model of the human, which has come from European social thought. I mean, I'm a European social theorist, you know, with a name like Bronislaw Szerszynski, you know, and you know, like, you know, I am a European, but you know, in some sense, I'm trying to also be true to this sense of a kind of intellectual crisis in European thought, you know, a sort of openness both to the other than human, but also to the other than Western, and to come up with a sort of yeah, if you like, yes, a frame of reference for the Anthropocene, which kind of speaks to those challenges, but also I think increasingly I'm trying to balance both the sense of a kind of moral urgency about the present, you know, the present time, the need to shift, for society to shift onto a new path metabolically and geopolitically, but also an awareness of deep time, you know, of planetary timescales, you know, and you know, as Joachim was saying, the idea of the potentiality, you know, that what is valuable about the Earth is not just its kind of present arrangement, you know, of the biosphere and so on, but also its capacity to do new things in the future. And I think deep time thinking is, you know, balancing that with the sense of urgency is a real challenge as well.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks.
also, Carl, thank you very much, because I believe that this is a very pressing question that we also in this seminar series should take into account. I took your question as a methodological question also. So what is the, from a philosophical perspective, how can we distinguish between science fiction or theorizing and test also in a rigorous way what is the truth claim, even if the word truth is of course not easy to use nowadays, but what is the truth claim of the things that we as philosophers bring to the floor? And when you were asking this question, and I thought when I was listening to Bronislav's response, it reminded me of what Nietzsche is saying about testing a thought, because he is talking about Einverleibung, internalization. So if you have a concept like God or freedom, then you internalize this concept and you have to think about, can I still live my life in light of this concept? Can I apply it? Is it applicable in a way in my daily life, in my world? And if it's not, then I have to deconstruct this notion and I have to explore others and I have to digest them. If Bronislaw is talking about metabolism, it's also a sort of conceptual metabolism in which we try to make sense of framings, and that is also part of the seminar series, that we do this together. So in this regard, Bronislaw, that I really liked also that you took the freedom to explore a little bit more freely than your ideas, or what you called then earlier balloons, and that you exchanged also these ideas with us, and that we can also then try to make sense of it by digesting your ideas, and hopefully it inspires this audience also to come back next time and to join another speaker. I have to say that I lost who is the next one in the list, and given the fact that it's 4:30, I would like to thank you, Bronislaw, for your great presentation. I would like to thank Joachim again. I'm not sure whether he's there, for the questions that he raised, and also Carl and other contributors. If you're interested in this seminar series, please send an email to us if you want to be part of the list. If you have ideas for follow-up things, please let us know. Roel, I'm very sorry, but is it brief? One moment. Roel, I know he just made a mistake, I guess. Thank you very much. See you next time on the websites and etc. You can find the information where we gather and who is the next speaker. Bye bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.